Deep within the Sega archives lies a treasure trove of beloved yet seemingly forgotten games. From Jet Set Radio and Burning Rangers to Streets of Rage and Shinobi, Sega's history is rich in games which, while still held in high regard by fans, are unlikely to re-emerge in the modern era. The same can be said of Team Andromeda's legendary Panzer Dragoon series. Panzer Dragoon launched alongside the ill-fated Sega Saturn in North America, and would go on to receive 3 sequels over the course of 7 years, including a sprawling role-playing adventure. Despite critical acclaim, the series never quite found an audience large enough to sustain itself, and disappeared after making an appearance on the original Xbox. On today's episode then, our Panzer Dragoon retrospective kicks off with a look at the original game and its sequel, Panzer Dragoon Zwei. We're exploring the beginnings of the series, examining the basics of its design, and showcasing the ways in which it makes use of the Sega Saturn hardware. We're also examining each port and conversion of Panzer Dragoon, including the obscure NVIDIA NV1 accelerated release of the game running on NVIDIA's very first GPU. All this and more is coming up on this Sega-focused episode of DF Retro. Let's get started. Panzer Dragoon first appeared in 1995, and is the first project helmed by Yukio Futatsugi. At just 23 years old, he pitched several ideas to Sega management, and much to his surprise, the proposal that would become Panzer Dragoon was accepted, and he was placed in charge of a team to build it. At its core, the original Panzer Dragoon feels like an amalgamation of a rail shooter and a cinematic art-focused experience. On the shooter side, Sega itself helped pioneer rail shooters with arcade games such as 1982's Buck Rogers' Planet of Zoom and 1985's seminal Space Harrier. The idea is simple. Players guide a character around the screen across a 3-dimensional representation of the stage. Enemies appear in set patterns requiring the player to return fire while dodging incoming attacks. Over time, games such as Afterburner and Galaxy Force 2 pushed the limits of what was possible using Sega's superscalar technology, while Nintendo's Star Fox offered a true 3D experience using simplistic polygons. While these games offered a uniquely engaging gameplay experience, it was really the spectacle that left the strongest impression. Soaring above a battlefield at high speed was an exhilarating experience made possible thanks to burgeoning 3D technology of the era. It was only natural then that Sega would choose to develop such a game to launch alongside its brand new console, the Sega Saturn. A rail shooter would help showcase what the new machine was truly capable of.
Sega Saturn, the most powerful, the most technologically advanced game system anywhere.
On the art side, however, Panzer Dragoon offers something a little different. While most rail shooters of this era focused on bright colors, big spaceships, and large creatures, director Yukio Futatsugi wanted something different. Working with art designer Manabu Kusunoki, Panzer Dragoon instead adopted muted colors, otherworldly designs, and its own fictional language. It may be a rail shooter, but Panzer Dragoon boasts an engaging world that seemingly extends beyond the confines of your television screen. It's this combination of carefully crafted Sega-style arcade gameplay and outstanding visual design which defines this game. As development completed, the path to success seemed clear, but Panzer Dragoon would have to weather a storm of Sega's own creation first. Transitioning from one console generation to the next is never easy, but Sega's transition between the Mega Drive and the Saturn was more challenging than most. The Saturn hardware itself was complicated and difficult to develop for, while the failure of the 32X add-on divided its development teams and weakened consumer confidence in the company. While Panzer is synonymous with the Saturn, there's actually visual evidence that the game may have first been in development for the 32X. This promotional tape features a brief glimpse at a similar looking concept. Sega was also feeling the heat of the competition. The Sony PlayStation was off to a strong start in Japan, and its lineup of games showcased 3D graphics with more detail than anything on the Saturn. Compared to the impressive Ridge Racer with its near arcade quality visuals, games like Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA fell kinda short. Panzer Dragoon, on the other hand, presented the first example of an impressive Sega Saturn game that could truly stand toe-to-toe with the best Sony's machine had to offer. Now, before we dive into its technical achievements, I want to first discuss the gameplay. You see, prior to the release of Panzer Dragoon, the typical rail shooter would move in one direction, forward. You control your positioning and weapons, but that's it. With Panzer Dragoon, an extra dimension is added to the mix with the ability to rotate the camera using the shoulder buttons. This basically means that enemies can now appear anywhere around the player, and boss patterns can become more nuanced and complex. As a full 3D game, Panzer Dragoon also features level design with more obstacles and structures to fly in and around. Games like Star Fox previously dabbled with this already, but Panzer Dragoon takes things a lot further. Panzer also presents a refined targeting system compared to previous Sega games, enabling players to basically paint targets with a reticle while holding the fire button. Removing your thumb then unleashes an attack. It's a system we'd later see in Nintendo's Star Fox 64, and it works really well here. Now, as an early Saturn game, Panzer Dragoon isn't exactly deep. It can be finished within an hour or so if you're skilled, and there aren't that many stages here, but what is included is certainly memorable. From the moment you load the game up, it makes a strong first impression. The CGI cutscenes are a step above many other comparable games of this era, and pre-rendered movies themselves were still kind of a huge attraction. Really though, it's the game's opening stage that is perhaps most fondly remembered here. Featuring the ruins of a sunken city, players begin the game gliding just above the surface of the water while weaving through pillars and dispatching foes along the way. It's difficult to describe the experience of playing this back in '95, but it certainly was something. Another key element in defining the experience is the soundtrack. Composed by musician Yoshitaka Azuma, the game features a soundtrack carefully scored to match the on-screen action. You see, as this was a linear shooter, it was possible to write music which coincided with specific in-game moments, leading to a more dramatic overall presentation. And while CD audio had become common in the past due to older CD-based machines like Sega CD, Panzer manages to stand out thanks to the quality of its compositions. Earlier it was suggested that the Saturn is difficult to design for, and that's certainly true. Team Andromeda found itself challenged in creating Panzer Dragoon, so much so that they missed the Japanese launch in late '94, instead launching the following spring. Despite the challenges in creating the game for Saturn, however, the programmers made excellent use of the hardware, which is precisely what's impressive about this game. The developers may not have pushed any technical boundaries, but it makes smart use of available resources. Case in point, the stages. While relatively simplistic, each one is designed to convey a grand sense of scale. The number of polygons needed to create such a large playfield is prohibitively expensive, however, and displaying such a large flat surface on something like the competing PlayStation would be rather difficult to impossible at this size and scope. Thus, the designers opted to offload the terrain and sky display to Saturn's Video Display Processor 2. The VDP-2, as it's called, can use infinite planes to draw large flat tile maps which can be freely rotated and scaled on 3 axes without any visible distortion. VDP-1 then is used to draw the additional polygons across the surface of the tile map, bringing depth to the playfield. For those that aren't familiar with the Saturn, think of VDP-1 as a sort of sprite engine which transforms square or rectangle bitmap images based on a set of predefined vertices. This is basically where you get your quad primitive used to build objects. We've been able to divide up the output of VDP-1 and 2 here thanks to the Saturn emulator Yabaose. Using the high resolution option included in the emulator, all objects drawn by VDP-1 appear sharper than on real hardware, and we're able to see precisely what is being drawn by that video display processor. VDP-2, however, is displaying a defined tile map with a fixed resolution. Thus, even with the high-res mode engaged, it remains pixelated. The VDP-2 layer is also capable of being used in some rather interesting ways. The water effect in Stage 1, for instance, appears to be the result of manipulating the tile map on a per-line basis, giving the impression of actual ripples across its surface. VDP2 is also used to create the illusion of a horizon. A gradient is applied along this horizon to give the impression of greater distances. Keep this in mind when we start looking at the future ports. Conversely, VDP1 is used to create the reflection scene here by placing specific flat textures below relevant objects. Each pillar has an associated reflection bitmap placed below it, and it's a reasonably convincing effect for the time. Unfortunately, as an early Saturn title, the development team was not able to optimize for a higher frame rate, and as such, Panzer Dragoon runs at just 20 frames per second. That said, it's worth keeping in mind that during this era, smooth, fluid 3D graphics were still relatively uncommon, and a mostly stable 20 FPS is a lot smoother than many other pre-Saturn consoles tended to deliver. Your average 3DO and Jaguar 3D game fell way below 20 FPS. Knowing the difficulties in developing for the Saturn then makes it a little easier to forgive the performance in this game, especially knowing where the team goes with its sequels in terms of performance. Really though, Panzer Dragoon is not exactly about pushing any boundaries. That will be reserved for its two sequels. Rather, I believe that Team Andromeda deserves credit for taking advantage of the hardware's unique dual video display processors right at launch.
The original game made quite an impact at launch, and as one of the Saturn's first titles, one would have expected them to remain exclusive. But Sega's PC initiative of the mid-90s extended its life.
In 1996, Sega launched Panzer Dragoon on the PC. And on the surface, it looks very similar to the Saturn version, but there are numerous changes implemented in this version. For starters, the PC supports 3 display modes out of the box: a low-resolution 320x200 mode using 8-bit color, and 2 640x480 high-resolution modes. The highest quality option renders at this resolution using 16-bit color, allowing smoother gradients, but the other option drops this to 8-bit color just like the low-res mode. The color differences here are rather noticeable on the horizon. Using a lower color depth eliminates the smooth gradients that you see in the 16-bit color mode and on Saturn. Curiously, while the effect is present in the high color mode, it does introduce a stippling pattern that is rather different from what we see on Saturn. Of course, Panzer Dragoon is a demanding PC game for its day. Running on a Pentium 133MHz class machine with a mid-range SVGA card, the low-res 8-bit mode runs just fine and plays as it should, though it falls short of matching the visuals presented on the Saturn. The much nicer looking high-resolution modes, however, really struggle on this machine, suggesting that you're going to want a fast 2D graphics card if you're building a retro PC for a game like this. You can, however, dial back the detail settings to low, which basically eliminates the floor and sky, a lot like disabling VDP2 using a Saturn emulator. Which is interesting here, as this applies to the way the floor is generated. It does seem to vary from the Saturn version slightly, but it also does appear to be using a tile map, since it retains the same pixelation even when using the 480p mode. Of course, the PC is a very different piece of hardware compared to Saturn, and these tile maps are simply generated on the CPU rather than offloaded to bespoke hardware. But what if you do have additional hardware? That's where the NVIDIA NV1 comes into play. Released in the mid-90s, the NV1 chip is NVIDIA's very first 3D accelerator card. It renders using quads rather than triangles, but lacks support for things like bilinear texture filtering or other advanced blending features that would become common in the years following its release. And seeing that this was first released in 1995, the lack of these features is perfectly understandable, but ultimately, its reliance on quads as primitives rather than triangles ultimately killed any potential it might have due to compatibility issues. That didn't stop Sega from bringing its games to the card, however. Diamond Multimedia released a version that included Sega Saturn controllers and several games, including Virtua Fighter and, of course, a special accelerated version of Panzer Dragoon. This version was never sold separately, but as you can see, it looks rather nice. In fact, this might be the most stable looking version of the game yet. Compared to the Saturn, it does once again look a little different. The distant gradient is displayed in a unique fashion here, and the overall color scheme varies a tad, appearing more in line with the vanilla PC port. The acceleration offered by the NV1, however, enables much smoother gameplay even at high resolutions.
which is precisely the reason for getting a 3D card at the time, isn't it? Faster frame rates all around. Now that we've seen all the PC versions though, there is one feature I want to point out. On the Saturn, the developers used a trick on VDP-1 to give the illusion of fake transparency. You can actually see through the beams of light to a very limited degree, but in the vanilla PC version this effect is completely absent and all the beams are opaque. When using the NV1 however, this effect is restored. Neat.
And the PC version of Panzer Dragoon made another appearance years later as an unlockable feature in Panzer Dragoon Orta for the Xbox. After completing the game, you're given the opportunity to play this conversion, and the results are rather interesting.
On Xbox, this port of the original Panzer Dragoon runs at the correct speed matching the Sega Saturn version. As this is a port of the PC version, however, it shares all of those same visual tweaks and changes. There's no transparency effect for weapon blasts, the sky texture is different, and there are tweaks made to the color palette. On the other hand, the Xbox version does appear to smooth out the mesh transparencies for things like the targeting cone and these beams of light. Of course, this could also be due to the strong filter the game uses. Even when outputting in 480p, the image is heavily filtered and very soft, like a number of other Xbox games. On one hand, this reduces overall sharpness, leading to a rather blurry image, but on the other, the blur kinda helps smooth out some of the visual flaws with the game, and it looks alright. Even with these issues though, this is still a solid version of the original Panzer Dragoon, and it plays a lot better than the PC version did on PCs of its era. In fact, it's much closer to, say, the NV1 version of the game that very few people got to play, and it works great on the Xbox. Now, if you want to unlock this feature for yourself, you need a copy of Panzer Dragoon Orta. Finish the game or rack up a total of 5 hours and it will unlock in the Pandora's Box mode. It's certainly a nice bonus. But there's more. The original Panzer Dragoon was also released on PlayStation 2 under the Sega Ages banner in Japan only. This version includes two modes, the Saturn mode and an arranged mode. Let's start with the Saturn mode. When selecting this from the menu, the PS2 shows a Saturn boot up logo, which might lead you to believe that this is using emulation. But when you dig in, you'll soon discover that that's not the case. In fact, right from the beginning, it's clear that we're really just looking at another PC port here, with some minor changes. Real transparency is now present across the game, including the targeting cone and the shafts of light that burst through this area, which is a nice feature. But on the other hand, the horizon shading is missing entirely, the cloud layer is a match for the PC version, and the color palette has changed as well. The only thing it really has in common with the original Saturn version, besides the basic game, is the fact that it's running in a lower resolution mode. But that doesn't really make this the Saturn version. If we jump over to the arrange mode though, we start to see some nice improvements. For starters, the resolution is increased with smoother lines and less visible shimmering across the scene. Texture filtering is enabled, smoothing out chunky textures, and overall image stability is improved as a result. In fact, this is probably the best the game has ever looked from an image quality perspective, and it's the best reason to own this version of Panzer Dragoon. So the PS2 release is kind of a mixed bag overall then. The arrange mode is nice and fun to revisit if you're familiar with the Saturn version, but the actual Saturn mode included in the PS2 release is not accurate. That they went so far to include the Saturn's boot up logo screen is neat here, but when the resulting portrayal of the game is inaccurate, it kind of feels like the developer missed the mark. In that sense then, I kind of place the PS2 version below the Saturn and NV1 versions, but above the Xbox and regular PC ports. And this PS2 version of the game would be the final re-release of Panzer Dragoon 1. But prior to this, there were a couple other attempts to bring the game to less capable platforms. First and foremost, we have Panzer Dragoon Mini for the Game Gear. Released only in Japan, this Game Gear specific version of the game is a dead simple recreation. The basics are there. You target enemies by painting them with a crosshair and let go to fire. You can't manually rotate the camera, mind you, but they do fake it when engaging certain bosses, which is a nice touch. This version also includes some rather cool remixes of songs from Panzer Dragoon Zwei using the PSG audio of the Game Gear. Unfortunately, so much is lost in the translation that it really winds up not being a lot of fun to play. There's no variation in scenery, and enemy patterns are extremely basic. The only thing that really changes between each stage is the color of the floor, and there just isn't a whole lot to do here. Now, the system isn't well suited for this type of gameplay, obviously, but other attempts at porting, say, Superscalar games to the Game Gear were a lot more successful than this. Panzer Dragoon Mini is just boring. The other option is one I don't own, unfortunately, and that's Panzer Dragoon for Tiger R-Zone. The YouTube channel This Is Cool Gaming produced a little video showcasing the game running on the system, and as you can see, it's basically one of those Tiger Electronics games from the early 90s, and it looks really bad. Between this and the Gamecom, Sega made some questionable choices in regards to where it releases its games, that's for sure. And in terms of original releases for the series, that's about it.
While Panzer received a huge number of ports, the rest of the series has remained exclusive to each original platform, which brings us to the first sequel, Panzer Dragoon Zwei.
This is a game that truly exhibits all the qualities of a great sequel. The disc itself proudly proclaims this to be one of the best 3D shooter games available, presented for your pleasure, and it couldn't be more accurate. The best ideas from the original game have returned, while new purpose has been given to the experience as a whole. Stages now include multiple paths, with different enemies along each route offering additional replay. Increasing your shot down percentage at the end of each stage also causes your dragon to evolve, enhancing his abilities throughout the game. And a new special attack has been introduced, which allows you to essentially unleash a huge blast while using the meter that fills during normal gameplay. Beyond that, the sequel now includes more stages overall, including sections taking place entirely on the ground, and the targeting system itself is now more fluid than ever, allowing you to more smoothly turn the camera. Speaking of the camera, the 3 options available in the first game, which allow you to choose your view, have been eliminated, replaced instead with a smarter overall camera system that never gets in the way. These changes extend to the underlying technology as well. With extra Saturn experience under their belt, Team Andromeda was able to push more detail on every stage while simultaneously boosting the frame rate. This time around, the Saturn delivers a more fluid 30 frames per second during gameplay with minimal drops, while the cutscenes now operate at a full 60 frames per second, though individual animations are still updated at half rate. Oh, and the game features a nice high-resolution menu screen as well, which was kind of a trend on the Saturn. You may have also noticed by now that Panzer Dragoon Zwei offers full support for 16:9 widescreen, a true rarity in this era, and beyond that, there's plenty of new visual tricks on display this time around as well. The VDP-2 water tricks featured in the original give way to a drastically enhanced take on the effect that updates more smoothly on a per-line basis, enabling startlingly smooth water animation that simply wasn't possible on competing consoles at the time. The developers also found unique ways to expand the scope of certain stages. At one point you arrive on a bridge, the background fades in, and then the bridge begins to ascend. The VDP-2 based background scrolls upward, giving the impression of motion in that direction, and it's surprisingly effective. We see the same thing in certain stages where you essentially leap from a cliff and then descend down to a lower level. There's basically a much greater scale presented here in this game than the original, and the levels go more interesting places. Of course, the basic makeup of the levels is fairly similar to the original game. Viewing it here using an emulator, you can still see that VDP-2 handles the floor and sky just like the original, but this time VDP-1 has a lot more to worry about with a higher density of on-screen objects throughout each stage. Impressive, considering the faster overall frame rate. The emulator also gives us a better idea how that cliff jump sequence works. On real hardware it looks rather seamless, but here you can see that they simply build polygons using VDP-1 right at the edge of the VDP-2 layer, which acts as a transition piece between the two tile maps. Then we have the music. The original game relies primarily on pre-recorded CD audio tracks read directly from the disc. While this provides excellent sound quality, it also places a greater restriction on storage space for the game and the number of tracks in the game itself. Panzer Zwei only includes 3 audio tracks in the disc. The rest make use of the Sega sound format, which is basically sequenced audio tracks played back using samples, and it sounds really good. Ultimately, Panzer Dragoon Zwei is a significant improvement over the already excellent original. For its day, there really was not a better rail shooter than this. It's a real gem of a game and still worth playing today. The question is then, how should you play these games today? While we've looked at every available version for each system, the fact is that none of these versions exist for a modern, easily accessible device. Thus, I would recommend playing on a real Sega Saturn first and foremost, as that is likely one of the easier methods, believe it or not. The PC version doesn't really work well on a modern PC, the PS2 import is uncommon and expensive, and the Xbox version requires, well, an original Xbox and a copy of Panzer Dragoon Orta. Thus, if you can't play it on any of those solutions, the second best option in my opinion is to use something like an emulator, of which there are several options. I like using Yabaose myself, but as you can see in this video, I've demonstrated its functionality in highlighting the individual layers, but it actually works quite well if you simply wish to play the games as is. It's possible to play in higher resolutions if you like, or simply stick with a more pixelated image, a la a genuine Saturn. Emulation isn't perfect, as there are some minor visual issues that crop up from time to time, but it's reasonably close and it plays well. Still, whether you're playing through emulation or using original hardware, Panzer Dragoon is still a game worth checking out today.
From its initial appearance on the Sega Saturn to its various conversions and its first sequel, Panzer Dragoon retains a special place in the hearts of many a Sega fan. Its simple yet smooth arcade-style gameplay and stylish presentation still have a lot to offer even today.
The DF Retro Panzer Dragoon saga is not yet over, however. At some point in a future episode this year, I'll be tackling the rest of the series. So do keep an eye out for that.
And with that, we've come to the end of another episode. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to let us know by liking, subscribing, and following us over on Twitter. And until next time, stay retro.